Hi there, folks. Today's lecture will be on tools for resolving ethical dilemmas. We are going to be talking about ethical dilemmas in a bit more detail and applying the tools that are available for helping resolve them to some real-life case studies. We'll start by going over some clues that you may be encountering an ethical dilemma in your practice. Then we will briefly review the ethical rules screen and ethical principles screen that you learned about in your Dolgoff reading. Then I will present some case studies at the micro, meso, and macro levels that involve ethical dilemmas and suggest how you might use these tools to resolve them. So, how do you know when you may be encountering an ethical dilemma in your practice? I know I, for one, don't necessarily carry the code of ethics around with me while I'm at work, though it is a good idea to have a copy handy. I've found that I often rely on my gut and intuition to alert me that a potential ethical dilemma is occurring or about to occur. I'll notice myself feeling uneasy or uncomfortable about something that has been said or done, which I call a red flag. The next step is to engage in some reflection about why this red flag has come up for me. You'll recall a critical component of social work is practice, which means engaging in a dialectical process of action and reflection. It can be difficult to find time to reflect in our busy work lives, but I strongly encourage you to build in some time for yourself, perhaps as you are driving home from work, to reflect on any red flags you encountered during the day. Supervision is another great time to reflect upon and discuss potential ethical dilemmas you have encountered that week. Once you've identified an ethical dilemma, the Ethical Rules Screen, or ERS, and Ethical Principles Screen, EPS, are two tools that may be helpful to you. As a reminder, the ERS and EPS are tools for you to use, but they don't replace your own critical thinking. The ERS screening should always be used first. The EPS may be used if the ERS indicates so. Therefore, some ethical dilemmas can be resolved using the ERS only. However, oftentimes multiple rules and principles are in conflict in an ethical dilemma, which is where the EPS comes into play. Recall that the EPS provides a ranking of various ethical principles in order from most important to least important. As a brief review, let's define what we mean by these principles. The first principle is pretty straightforward. In life or death situations involving your client, clients, or others, protection of life always takes precedence. The principle of social justice, which is also entitled equality or inequality in some versions of the screen, mean that individuals with equal power and standing should be treated equally, but individuals with unequal power and standing should be assisted to gain equality, such as in this picture. An example of this is affirmative action. Autonomy and freedom pertains to the importance of protecting our clients' and communities' civil rights and allowing them to engage in self-determination. As you will hear in a moment, I unfortunately have to violate this principle all the time in my work. When faced with two or more choices that are less than ideal, social workers should apply the least harm principle, meaning they should select the choice that is likely to cause the least harm or the harm that is most temporary and or reversible. Social workers should promote the quality of life of all individuals and communities. After all, our goal is to make the world a better place, right? You may be surprised to see that privacy and confidentiality is ranked so low on the list, considering how much emphasis is put on these issues. Obviously, confidentiality remains critically important, but it can be overridden by other more pressing principles, such as protection of life. For example, under duty to warn, social workers are required to break confidentiality to inform a potential target of assault or homicide. Lastly, our lowest ranked but still important principle of truthfulness and full disclosure pertains to accurately disclosing all relevant information to clients and communities. In my opinion, our code of ethics is what really sets social work apart from other similar professions. However, the code is more easily applicable to micro practice, even though social workers working at the meso and macro levels are held to it as well. This can sometimes make resolving ethical dilemmas more difficult for meso and macro workers. If you'd like to learn more about how the code of ethics can be applied to meso and macro practice, I recommend that you check out the Barsky readings for this week. In the meantime, let's examine how these principles can be applied at the various practice levels by taking a look at some case studies. I currently work as a crisis worker for Intermountain Healthcare, which means I meet with patients who are suicidal, homicidal, and psychotic in various emergency departments throughout the state. I frequently have to place patients on what is called a blue sheet, which is a 24 involuntary hold. This allows me to place patients in an inpatient behavioral unit against their will. In these scenarios, which principle am I prioritizing over which other principle or principles? Take a moment to look at the EPS and come up with your answer. If you guessed that I'm valuing protection of life over self-determination, autonomy, and freedom, and in some cases, privacy and confidentiality, and maybe even quality of life, you would be correct. I never enjoy taking away individual civil rights, but it is my duty to keep them and others safe from harm. In a previous administrative job I had at a nonprofit agency, we received and began administering a grant that would allow us to provide housing assistance for families who were impacted by domestic violence. We selected a few families to begin providing housing assistance to. It was a pilot project, and so there was a steep learning curve, not only for my agency, but also for the agency that administered the grant. We initially hoped that the families would become self-sufficient after 3 months of receiving rental assistance. However, we found that most of our families continued to need full rent and utilities assistance after 6 or more months of assistance. The result of this was that we ultimately lost the grant, as we were not able to help nearly as many families as we had projected we would be able to. Take a moment to think about what ethical principles may have been at play in this case study. I feel this is an example of the least harm principle taking precedent over quality of life. If we had cut off the funding for our families at 3 months, we may have been able to keep the grant money to improve the quality of life of future clients. However, we feared that cutting off the funding prematurely would be extremely harmful for the families currently receiving the assistance, as it would have resulted in eviction, worsening credit and rent histories, and further instability and trauma. Instead, we chose to swallow our pride and minimize the fallout of accepting a housing grant that wasn't a good fit for our agency and population. A few years ago, a friend and colleague of mine planned to attend a rally to raise awareness about police brutality against people of color. While perusing the Facebook page for the event, she noticed that nearly all of the individuals slotted to speak at the event were Caucasian. She sent a private message to the organizers of the rally, suggesting that they provide time and space for people of color to speak from their own lived experience at the rally. The organizers replied, stating that they were allotting time for all of the individuals who requested to speak at the rally. My friend ultimately decided against going to the rally. Which ethical principle or principles may she have felt were being violated in this example? In this example, my interpretation is that my friend felt the rally organizers were prioritizing the principle of self-determination over the principle of social justice or equality and inequality. In its current form, she felt the rally would be misguided and counterproductive to the cause it intended to support, and so she chose not to attend. In all of these cases I shared today, you may come up with alternative solutions and justifications based on the ERS and EPS. Again, these are tools that require critical thought and interpretation. In the case of some ethical dilemmas, there may be not one right answer, but multiple possible solutions, which require a good deal of consideration.